Courtroom drama is not typically something that you associate with a fantasy novel. And yet, somehow, even in a fantasy world, you have to decide who's guilty and who's innocent. So today, let's talk about prosecution in a fantasy world. Hello, and welcome to another episode of Just in Time Worlds. My name is Marie Mullaney, and I'm going to discuss today's topic by breaking it down into your starting assumptions, the actual process around deciding who is innocent and who is guilty, testimony versus evidence, and finally, I'll walk you through the questions that I like to ask when I'm considering putting together a system of the judiciary in a fantasy world. If you like this kind of content, please do hit the like button. If you really like this kind of content, I have an account over at ko-fi.com/justintimeworlds where you can buy me a cup of coffee for €1. Okay, let's get cracking. So first, let's talk about your starting assumptions. Now, what I mean by this is, do you assume that someone is innocent or that they are guilty? It's very easy to say we assume people are innocent until proven guilty. But that is not the only system that exists, nor is it the only system that has existed in our history. We have had many legal systems where the assumption is that you are guilty when accused. And that means that when you go to court to defend not your innocence, but to prove your innocence. And that shifts the onus of proof from the state to the defendant. Now, why do I want to highlight this as a model? Because it makes for a more intense story. If your hero is assumed to be guilty and now has been accused of a crime, he has to spend time running around proving his innocence. He has to gather testimony. He has to provide the court with a reason as to why he is innocent. And so, because it changes where the burden of proof lies, it changes the dynamic of the power structure of the court. Now, obviously, in a system like that, you have to prevent frivolous lawsuits very fiercely. And quite often such a system would have a punishment, a law-based punishment for bringing wrongful accusations to the court. It does provide a very interesting dynamic from a fantasy world perspective in terms of hooking the character into a story, or if you're running a role-playing game, hooking your players into a story by having one of them accused of a crime. So that's your starting point assumptions and where they lead. But that still leads to how do you prove your innocence or your guilt for that matter. So let's talk about testimony and how it's been used in the past. Now, until the modern age with its ability to gather forensic evidence, the predominantly settled means of deciding whether someone is guilty or innocent is through testimony, which is a model used in Legend of the Five Rings especially effectively. The problem with testimony is that if you have 100 observers, you have 100 points of view. So that's obviously the first and the problem we see in the modern day and age as well, is people misremember. What they think they saw is not what they saw. But from a writer's perspective, that's golden. Or from a games master's perspective. Because you have an open doorway where there's the truth and there's what people saw and there's what you're going to claim in court. Testimony is actually a great tool in your tool belt. In a highly stratified society, a society with a lot of classes, the additional problem with testimony is the higher someone ranks, the more weight their testimony bears. As I said, Legend of the Five Rings does this particularly well. The daimyo of a clan can literally get away with murder unless the emperor himself says that they are a murderer. That same dynamic applies, for example, in Catherine Kerr's Devery world from an authorial perspective, where the higher ranking the person is, the more weight their testimony bears. And then this is additionally complicated with the nobles themselves being the judges. So if you wanted to accuse a Gjurbret, which is like a duke in Devery, of committing a crime, you'd be taking the matter before the Gjurbret himself. So you're asking a man to judge himself. Of course he's going to say he's innocent. How would he say otherwise? If your judicial system is not actually separated from your class system, and your testimony counts for more because of your class system, and your judge is the ranking noble, you have a situation where you literally cannot accuse this person of anything. Now, that can actually make for a great story. And Catherine Kerr is currently telling that story in her latest Devery novels, which started with Sword of Fire, and you can check out my 1-minute review of Sword of Fire right over there. That is literally the premise of the story. The nobles cannot be accused because they are the judge and the highest form of testimony. So the only way is societal change. And that is a great story to tell. But back to prosecution in a fantasy world. Trial by combat is actually a form of testimony-based evidence. It is the literal proof of the gods prove that my testimony is worth more than your testimony because I've beaten you in a trial by combat. Whether the gods actually take a hand in this is entirely up to you. I have seen fantasy novels where the gods do touch the combatants, and the decision of a trial by combat is made by the gods. I have also seen where it's just dependent on whose sword arm is better. Both flavors have got their benefits. On the one hand, having a god-touched trial by combat makes it a very intensive experience, and then brings about the question of, can the gods ever be wrong? And then you can tell a truly fascinating story when the gods are wrong. And you can tie that into your religious philosophy and maybe force a societal change or write a whole story around somebody who has been wronged by the gods in a trial by combat. On the other hand, if the gods are not interfering and it's just your sword arm, that's also an interesting story to tell. I don't think any of us will soon forget Tyrion's trial by combat. You raped my sister, you killed her children. It was an iconic TV moment, and for those of us who've read the books, it was a stunning moment in the books as well. So trial by combat, as part of your whole testimony model, can definitely add elements both of a final court of appeal and of exciting action moments to your courtroom drama. Of course, you don't have to go with testimony-based prosecution. You can also utilize evidence. Your problem in a fantasy-based world with evidence is, how do you gather that evidence? How do you preserve it? What is the chain of custody? Now, those are very interesting things in the modern world and in modern courtroom dramas, but from a fantasy perspective, what are you going to do? How are you going to gather fingerprints, prove somebody's presence? You're going to end up using magic. The problem with magic is it's very easy to go overboard here. If you, for example, insert truth magic or divination magic into your judicial system, you can end up in the same position as in a trial by combat, where it's always the final decision of the truth stone or the past seer or whatever it is that's utilizing the magic in prosecution. Of course, again, you can tell an interesting story about somebody wronged by that. So a great story that was actually told around this was the Minority Report movie, which was a science fiction movie where there were these three people who saw future crimes. And they saw the main character committing a future crime, and people came to arrest him. And the whole story is him trying to prove that actually the future doesn't have to happen. It didn't have to happen that he commits a murder. You can work with divination and truth magic in your judicial system, but be careful. Don't go overboard here. Remember, you're trying to tell a story, and for a story, there has to be elements of tension and hooks. And you don't get tension and hooks with perfect systems. The same when you're running a role-playing game. Your players are likely to commit a crime at some point or the other. they normally do in my experience. So you want to make sure that you have a way for them to get out of it, unless you're cool with killing the party and starting over. Which, I mean, to be fair, there are times when you should kill the party. But doing it every other week because, they stole the greenskins' treasure is probably not the best way to go about it. So much for evidence and magic and its impact. Let's discuss those questions that I like to ask myself. The first thing is to establish your role players. Who is allowed to level an accusation? What is your starting assumption? Who is your judge and how impartial are they? If they're supposed to be impartial, how is that impartiality guaranteed? Is there a jury? Is there a prosecutor? What about the court of public opinion? What role does the court of public opinion and the vote of the people, as it were, count? Is there special procedures and rituals around it? Does the judge need a special robe? Does he need to wear a wig? Is there a sword the judge carries? Is there a gavel-type device? Is a trial held in a specific place? Is it held on a specific day? So all of these make it very interesting and intricate when you then call a trial, if you can answer those questions. Then how? Do you have trial by combat? Are the gods involved? Does testimony count for more? Does evidence count for more? How do you gather that evidence and how do you preserve it? Lastly, and this one's important, so I hope you stuck around, don't forget about the fantastical elements. Maybe your judge chews a special mushroom and that gives him insight into the great truth that is out there. Or maybe there's a special cave where you can enter into if you're guilty, and the spirit of the cave shrives your soul, and if you survive the night and you come out, you are judged to be innocent because the cave says that you are innocent. All that has gone before has been cleansed from you. You can utilize the fantastical elements of your world to make your prosecution not just be about determining innocence or guilt, but really building out that fantastical feeling and bringing your readers or your players into this different experience where magic and fantasy is real. And that is my take on prosecution and law enforcement in a fantasy world. If you'd like to know more about catching criminals, I did a video on that over there, law enforcement in fantasy. If you enjoyed this video, please do hit the like button. If you really enjoyed it, I have an account over at ko-fi.com, Just in Time Worlds, €1 for a cup of coffee. And otherwise, I will see you soon for another episode of Just in Time World.